Hi, my name is Melissa Gallagher, and I'm an assistant professor of mathematics education at the University of Houston. I'm here today to talk to you about supporting multilingual students' mathematics achievement. The focus of this lesson is going to be on modifying lessons to support multilingual learners. As such, you might want to have out your plan book or your teacher textbook so that you can modify the lessons as we go along and integrate the practices as I describe them. When we think about modifying lessons to support multilingual students, we really want to think about going through 5 steps. We're going to start by identifying your math topic, the topic of your lesson, and your mathematics goal for that lesson. Once you've got your math goal, then you're going to choose a language goal that serves the selected math goal. You're going to determine key vocabulary for the lesson, create sentence frames which serve the language functions of the lesson. At that point, we're actually going to sneak back around and revise our language goal, because going through those steps of determining key vocabulary and creating sentence frames can help us think about how to make our language goal more specific and measurable for students. And lastly, you're going to plan for opportunities to talk. So you're going to build in opportunities to talk in your lesson plan, thinking about how students can talk with you, with a partner, and in small groups. So let's jump in. The first thing that you want to do is identify your math topic and goal. A math topic is typically pretty easy for teachers to identify. That's usually the thing that you were planning on talking about that day. So for instance, the math topic I picked for us to use as an example today is adding numbers sums less than 20. This corresponds with the Louisiana State Standard 1OA-C6. Add and subtract within 20, demonstrating fluency for addition and subtraction with 10, and using mental strategies such as counting on, making 10, decomposing a number leading to 10, using the relationship between addition and subtraction, and creating equivalent but easier or known sums. One thing I really like about the way this standard is written is that it gives examples of possible mental strategies, which lets me know that this is not an exhaustive list. Students could use other strategies, and also students don't need to be able to use all of these strategies. They just need to be able to choose the most efficient strategy that will work for them to solve the problem. So given this standard and this topic, I considered my math goal to be that students will choose an efficient strategy when adding 2 numbers within 20. So the focus of my lesson will be on getting students to think about the most efficient strategy before they jump in and start using one. Now that I've chosen my math goal for the lesson, I'm going to pick a language goal. When we think about a language goal, we want to ask ourselves, what will students be able to express at the end of the lesson? So if they're achieving the math goal, what kind of language would I expect to hear or see? So for my language goal, I wrote that I want students to be able to explain their strategy and discuss if it was efficient. You'll see that as we go through the next 2 steps, once we come back, we'll reconsider and revise our language goal. So the next step is determining key vocabulary. Basically, we're picking some words. We can think about the key content terms, so the key math words that students might need to know for this lesson, or we could think about key or important general academic words that students might need to learn. Think about general academic words as words that cross genres, but nevertheless are more restricted to school. So for instance, the word describe or identify or efficient, those are not words that first graders typically use at home, which makes them more academic language, but they're also not words that are specific to math. We can think about identifying things in science or efficient strategies in reading. So when you're picking your key vocabulary in mathematics, you're not only thinking about math content vocabulary, but also general academic vocabulary that will support your students. You also might want to think about vocabulary that you're planning to use in your sentence frames. If those terms are unfamiliar, you might want to explicitly teach them as part of your key vocabulary. Another thing that's important to think about in mathematics is polysemous words. Polysemous words are words that have multiple meanings. In particular, these words are challenging when the meaning in mathematics is very different than the meaning in real life. So for instance, the word table students will know because of the tables that they sit at. But in mathematics, it has a very specific meaning as a way that we can organize data in columns and rows. So we want to consider polysemous words as possible key vocabulary for a lesson. We also want to provide synonyms and examples to help students understand those key vocabulary. And we want to make sure that we're refining our language goals to include key vocabulary. So when I think about this lesson, when I think about my math goal for this lesson, a really key term is the word efficient. In order for students to choose an efficient strategy and to determine if it's an efficient strategy, they need to know what efficient means. So I've revised my language goal here, and I've changed it to say students will use the word efficient consistently in their discussions. Putting this word in my language goal and bolding it lets me know that that's a key vocabulary that I'm going to plan to explicitly teach to my students at the start of the lesson. Once I've determined key vocabulary, I want to think about the language functions of my lesson, because knowing what the language functions are will help me create sentence frames to support those language functions. There are 4 genres of language functions or language uses. In math, we primarily see 2. In math, the primary language functions are explain, which would be the genre of language where humans are introducing mathematical ideas, sharing solutions, telling the strategies or steps that they did, describing the approach, stating their reasoning. So it's a retelling of details. Explain is also really about the how. So when we think about explaining how something happens, that falls under the language function of explain. The next thing that we can think about, the other language function in math, is argue. Argumentation language requires students to use precise terms, to generalize relationships, to justify conclusions, and also refute the ideas of others. Students can do this by using evidence with mathematical principles. We also want students to evaluate and extend others' arguments. So these are the 2 primary language functions in mathematics. I'm going to think about my lesson now, the adding sums within 20 and choosing an efficient strategy, and think about which language functions are really connected there. So as I'm thinking about my math goal for the day and the language function that matches, I feel that both explain and argue tie in really closely to this math goal. For instance, I really want students to be able to state the reasoning of how they generated their solutions, and I want them to evaluate and extend others' arguments. When I think about what this might sound like in my classroom, what might I hear if my students are explaining their reasoning and evaluating others' arguments within the context of this lesson of choosing an efficient strategy to mentally add within 20, I know that students, when they're explaining, they're going to need to tell the steps that they used. And so that really requires that sequential language and those transition words that students might not all be comfortable with yet. So I can create a sentence frame that supports students in explaining their strategies. The sentence frame might look like this: first I, then I, next I, last I. So that sentence frame is one that I would incorporate into this lesson to help students explain their strategies. The second language function that ties in really well is the argue function. When I think about what it would sound like if a student were meeting my math goal and arguing for a certain position, well, I really want them to discuss whether or not their strategy is efficient. So a student might say, I think blank strategy is efficient because blank. And that makes it an argument. So they're stating their purpose, they're stating their stance. I think blank strategy is efficient. And then because blank. So adding that because on as part of the sentence frame and explicitly setting that expectation at the outset of the lesson lets students know that they can't just say, oh, it's efficient, but they have to name the strategy and give a reason. And so that sets them up to be successful with argumentation from the start of the lesson. So remember I said we're going to sneak in a revisit of the language goal step. So we're going to go back to the language goal step here, and we're going to think about the steps that we just went through. And so you can see here that I have revised my language goal, and it is now 3 goals. So my language goals now are that students will use the word efficient consistently in their discussions. Students will describe the strategy that they used with words, pictures, or numbers. And then they might use the sentence frame, first I, then I, next I, last I. And then my last language goal is students will discuss the efficiency of the strategies used. I think blank strategy is efficient because blank. And so here we can see that I integrated the explain and argue as well as the key vocabulary. So we start off thinking about what students will be able to express at the end of the lesson, but going through those steps of determining key vocabulary and creating sentence frames will help us to refine our language goal, especially in consideration of the functions of language. So once you've got your math goal, your language goal, and specific vocabulary and sentence frames that you've identified, we want to plan for how you're going to introduce that academic language to students. Because just like everything else, we want to make sure that we're explicitly teaching it so the students know the expectation that they use it, and also so they have a background to understand it. When we think about our key vocabulary, we're going to create word cards. And a useful tip is to leave space for students to illustrate the card. This can be really helpful because our brains can only remember a finite number of words, but we have the ability to capture and remember an infinite number of pictures. So if we can help students tie a word to an image, we can help them store it in their long-term memory better. We also want to plan to explicitly teach the meanings of words. We want to set aside 5 or 10 minutes at the beginning of the lesson to explicitly teach those key vocabulary that we identified. I also find it's useful to write out the definition I plan on sharing with the students. You don't necessarily want to read out a dictionary definition, as that won't always help them. But sometimes if you're caught in the middle of the moment trying to come up with a kid-friendly definition, you can feel a little stuck. So especially at first, I suggest explicitly planning for the meanings that you will teach to students, as well as setting aside that time at the outset of your lesson. And then lastly, you want to ask students, once you've explicitly taught them the meaning of the words, you want to offer students a chance to add an illustration to that word card. That helps the students also not just to remember it visually, but also to take ownership for the words. When we think about introducing academic language, though, it's not just vocabulary. We want to teach students how to talk and write like mathematicians, which goes back to the language function conversation we were having earlier. So we came up with those sentence frames. Sentence frames help students produce academic language. They're helpful for students whether the language of instruction is students' first language or not. You want to take the sentence frames that you generated in the earlier steps and write them on posters or sentence strips. You do not want to have them on a slide that you'll project, because when you move to the next slide, then the sentence frame will be gone. And so you're pulling away the scaffold too soon. So you really want to have those up in a place in your room where students can continue to refer back to them, not only throughout the lesson, but in subsequent lessons as well. You want to explicitly teach how to use the sentence frame and model it with students. So in the beginning of your lesson, perhaps you would model how you would choose an efficient strategy, and then you could also model how you would use the 2 sentence frames to describe the steps in your strategy, and then to argue for why that strategy was efficient. When your students are talking, remind them of the sentence frame if they don't automatically use it, and point to it, because hopefully it will be up in your room. Again, you really want to make sure that those key vocabulary cards and sentence frames are in a location that are visible to all students and to you, both in this lesson and in future lessons. All right, the last step, the last thing we need to consider when planning to modify lessons to support multilingual students in mathematics is we want to consider how we can build in opportunities for students to talk. And so that means we're planning for opportunities for students to orally communicate. So in your lesson plans, you want to make note, where are students' opportunities to talk with the teacher, with a partner, and in small groups? They should have opportunities for all three in every math lesson. We also want to make sure to create opportunities for accountable talk. So sometimes if we tell students, turn and talk to your partner about this, and we don't keep an eye on them, or they don't know that they're being held accountable, they may go off topic and talk about whatever they like. If you have a classroom community that's really strong and a safe place for students to take risks, one strategy you can use is to tell students, after our turn and talk, I'm going to randomly call on a partner to share. If a person doesn't have the answer, then that is on them as well as their partner, because you're having this time to talk. So when you're discussing with your partner, make sure you both could answer the question if I call on you. When you call on students, then, of course, you'll end up calling at least once on a student who doesn't have an answer. At that point, you can turn to the class and say, okay, let me restate the directions. You're going to turn and talk. When you're done, I expect every person to have an answer to this question. Turn and talk, and I'll call on you again. Give them another opportunity to turn and talk, and then call on that child again. If you use that kind of practice repeatedly, then students will know that they're always accountable to answering the question that you've asked and staying on track. And also that it's not just on them, but on their partner as well. So if one partner is paying attention and the other is not, both have responsibility for both students' learning. That's called positive interdependence. Another really important thing to keep in mind when planning in opportunities for students to talk is that the person doing the talking is the person doing the learning. And so whose voice is heard most often during the lesson? If it's your voice as the teacher, then you want to consider how you can offer your students more opportunities to talk during the lesson. When thinking about opportunities to talk, you also want to think about who you might partner your students with. It can be helpful to partner students with different levels of language proficiency to help with clarifying concepts, especially at the beginning of a lesson. Additionally, as students are talking, you want to plan to repeat and also paraphrase what the students say in order to clarify their ideas. You also want to have students repeat and paraphrase what you say. That helps to model sentence structure and fluent oral language. So to revisit our steps, when we're modifying lessons to support multilingual learners in the mathematics classroom, we want to identify the math topic and goal, choose a language goal that corresponds with math goal, determine key vocabulary, create sentence frames that support the language function, and build in opportunities for student talk. Thank you so much for tuning in to my presentation today.